On November 4th, 1921, in a beer hall in southern Germany, people crowd around to listen to a fiery young speaker, just 32, but with all the charisma and authority of a seasoned politician. It's quite the scene, as the rusty old guard of Munich raises their glasses and gives rapturous applause to a man less than half their age. But not everyone agrees with this passionate young firebrand, and his speech is suddenly interrupted by the smashing of a glass and an unexpected gunshot aimed directly at the podium. Cheers turn to screams as the room erupts into hysteria. It doesn't take long for a full-on brawl to ensue, but the would-be assassins miss their target. The man on stage, Adolf Hitler, is left unscathed. In fact, he doesn't actually seem that bothered about it. He even continues his rant for another 20 minutes. No one knew it back then, but this survivor would soon rise to control an empire synonymous with evil, built on propaganda, persecution, and genocide, responsible for the Holocaust, the oppression of millions, and the devastation of Europe. This first attempt to execute Hitler may have been unsuccessful, but it wouldn't be the last. For the next 2.5 decades, as his power and influence soars, he would become the target of countless assassination attempts by rivals, political dissidents, foreign agents, and even those within his own ranks. Time after time, plans were set in motion, plans that could have rewritten history, saved millions of lives, and stopped the nightmare from pushing further. Plans, however, that were never able to put an end to the madness. This is the story of all 42 attempts on Hitler's life, from ordinary men with bombs hidden beneath their coats to spies in the shadows, all willing to give everything for one chance at a better future, but all ultimately failing, giving Hitler his second name as Der Unverwundbar, or the Invulnerable One. The 1920s were a turbulent decade in Germany, a nation still reeling from the aftermath of the First World War and the subsequent Treaty of Versailles. Amid the economic despair and political instability, a fledgling political party began to rise, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party as it came to be known, led by Adolf Hitler, an Austrian-born agitator with a gift for fiery oratory. This party promised a return to national greatness, a message that resonated with many disillusioned Germans. However, from the very beginning, there were those that saw through the rhetoric. They recognised Hitler for what he was, a dangerous demagogue whose chameleon-esque values and anti-Semitic ambitions threatened the fragile balance of power in post-war Europe. They saw the danger before anyone else did and were willing to risk whatever necessary to prevent his rise. These early attempts on Hitler's life were, in many ways, half measures, clumsily assembled and often doomed from the start. One of the earliest known attempts occurred in January 1932 when Hitler and several other high-ranking Nazis attended a dinner in Berlin. The meal, it seemed, had been poisoned, most likely by political rivals or disillusioned staff within the venue. Violent stomach cramps wrecked the attendees, and for several tense hours it seemed that Hitler's meteoric rise might end not in a blaze of gunfire, but in the quiet agony of a fatal poisoning. But while hurt, Hitler survived. The symptoms were actually quite severe, but as Hitler regained his strength, he began to see his survival as proof of divine providence, a conviction that would fuel his rhetoric and reinforce his belief in his own invincibility. Barely a month later, in February 1932, Ludwig Assner, a staunch political opponent, tried a similar approach, but with a different flavour: ricin, a powerful poison with which he planned to turn the tables. His plan was much subtler: send Hitler a letter laced with the lethal substance, concealed in such a way that it would be absorbed through the skin. But Assner's plot was betrayed by one of his accomplices, and he was discovered by the SS before the letter could even reach its intended target. He was arrested, interrogated, and eventually disappeared. Yet another victim of Hitler's growing network of secret police. But Assner's attempt to poison Hitler was not the only scheme to come. By March 1933, a group of communists formulated a daring plan. They intended to blow up the platform where Hitler was set to deliver a speech. The explosives were painstakingly smuggled in, and the stage was set. literally and figuratively. However, this time it was the newly formed Gestapo that came to Hitler's rescue. A police informer, possibly motivated by the increasing bounty the Nazis placed on political dissenters, decided to snitch. The communists were arrested, the explosives confiscated, and the crowd, unaware of how close they had come to witnessing history change, cheered for their future Führer without so much as a hair lost on his head. The spring of 1933 also saw the emergence of yet another figure who would play a role in the resistance against Hitler, Joseph Roemer. Roemer, a disillusioned former officer, had seen firsthand the consequences of Hitler's militarism and was determined to stop him. His plan was a tad simpler than the previous ones, perhaps even a bit crude. He was going to walk into the Reich Chancellery and shoot Hitler in his office. But the security around him had already tightened considerably, and Roemer was arrested before he even came close. The Gestapo yet again saving the day, money well spent on the Führer's part. This time, however, they decided to make an example of him, a first of many now publicised arrests intended to deter would-be assassins. The failure of these early attempts only strengthened Hitler's resolve, as well as his belief that he was not just a leader chosen by his people, but someone chosen by fate, protected by an unseen force. This belief would make him even more dangerous in the years to come as he grew bolder, more aggressive, and more convinced of his own destiny. By June 1934, Hitler had reached new heights after the infamous Night of the Long Knives, where he'd managed to eliminate many of his former allies in the Storm Detachment, the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party. The internal purges weren't totally successful, though, and led some surviving officers dubbed stormtroopers to seek revenge for what, in their eyes, was an unacceptable betrayal. One group plotted to ambush Hitler on a road to Munich, intending to use their knowledge of his schedule to catch him by surprise. But Hitler, either tipped off by his informants or simply changing plans on a whim, avoided the route entirely, and the plotters were left empty-handed. The year 1935 brought another serious threat, this time from a physician named Dr. Helmuth Milius. Milius, disgusted by the atrocities he'd witnessed, managed to infiltrate the SS in hopes of gaining proximity to Hitler. His plan was to use his access as a doctor to poison Hitler during a medical examination. However, before he could act, the Gestapo dismantled his network of conspirators, discovering and arresting Milius long before he got anywhere near close enough to carry out his plan. The following years also saw the increasing militarization of Germany and Hitler's consolidation of power. By 1936, Heinrich Grunio and Idel Sturm, two young idealists with connection to the resistance, sought to carry out their own assassination attempt. They intended to strike near the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat. But instead of killing Hitler, they mistakenly attacked Julius Schreck, Hitler's chauffeur, and one of his most loyal associates. It's an easy mistake to make, they do look quite similar, but this simple error would cost them their lives. Both were swiftly arrested, tortured, and executed for their miscalculation. Even as Hitler fortified his hold over Germany, the resistance continued, though it was clear that the Nazi surveillance network was tightening. By the late 1930s, the stakes were higher than ever. Hitler's ambitions had grown beyond Germany's border. He eyed Czechoslovakia, Austria, and not far behind, Poland. With every new conquest, the international willingness to appease dwindled, while the number of people willing to risk everything to see him dead grew further still. In the autumn of 1938, Lieutenant Colonel Hans Oster, a member of the Abwehr, a German military intelligence service, began plotting a coup. Oster was horrified by Hitler's plans to annex the Sudetenland, believing that such a move would inevitably lead to war with Britain and France, a war that Germany was not ready for. He planned to arrest and execute Hitler if Britain and France stood up to Germany, but when the Munich Agreement was signed and Britain and France effectively bent over and continued to appease Hitler by allowing the annexation, the coup fell apart. Oster and his co-conspirators were left waiting for another opportunity. November of that same year saw perhaps one of the most famous early attempts on Hitler's life from Maurice Bouvard, a Swiss theology student who believed he was on a divine mission to rid the world of Hitler, who he saw as the Antichrist himself. Armed with a small caliber pistol, Bouvard travelled to Germany and waited for an opportunity. He finally got his chance during a parade in Munich, posing as a reporter where he laid in wait until Hitler was scheduled to pass by. But as the Führer approached, the enthusiastic crowd surged forward, raising their arms in the Nazi salute, and the wall of saluting arms blocked Bouvard's line of sight, and he was unable to get a clear shot. He was later arrested while attempting to leave the country, and his failed assassination plot was discovered. Bouvard was executed years later in 1941. These early assassination attempts, daring and well-intended as they were ultimate failures, and for all their efforts, the Second World War had begun. As the international community found itself dragged into conflict barely 2 decades after the supposed war to end all wars, attempts on Adolf Hitler's life saw a sharp uptick. Perhaps the most significant attempt during the early years of the war was the bomb plot by George Elser, an event that undoubtedly would have dramatically altered the course of history if it had succeeded. On November 8th in 1939, in Munich's Bürgerbrücke, Adolf Hitler was scheduled to deliver his annual speech, commemorating the failed beer hall putsch of 1923, a pivotal moment that took place in that very same hall all those years ago, and had since been burned into Nazi folklore as the start of a glorious new era. Unbeknownst to Hitler, however, our George Elser, a carpenter, didn't quite see the beer hall putsch with the same rosy nostalgia. Instead, he'd spent the last months planning an assassination in hopes of bringing him down. Elser was no spy, nor a professional saboteur. He was a common man who recognised the growing horrors unfolding in Germany. He was driven not by orders from an intelligence agency or the lure of glory, but simple love of his country and his belief that Hitler's demise would prevent Germany's march to greater devastation. Elser was meticulous in his efforts. He spent weeks taking careful measurements inside the Bürgerbrücke, and for over 30 nights he would sneak into the hall to hollow out a space behind a column directly adjacent to the speaker's platform. There, he embedded a time bomb set to detonate during Hitler's speech. On the night of November 8th, Elser's plan was executed. Hitler, as anticipated, addressed the crowd in characteristic fashion, but fate intervened. Due to adverse weather, Hitler decided he would return to Berlin earlier than expected and cut his speech short. He left the Bürgerbrücke at 9:07 p.m., just 13 minutes before Elser's bomb detonated. The explosion was massive, tearing through the hall, killing 8 people and injuring more than 60 others, but missing its only intended target. Elser was apprehended that same evening when he was attempting to cross into Switzerland through the border town of Konstanz. He was arrested simply because he was showing erratic behaviour that drew suspicion. But then, while he was being held, news reached the border guards of the intent on the Führer's life, prompting a thorough search, which revealed his possession of bomb components and blueprints. Ultimately, this led to his arrest, and after identification by beer hall staff and a confession under Gestapo interrogation, the deal was sealed for him. Though his courage and solitary determination were remarkable, he never had the opportunity to witness the outcome of his sacrifice. He was held in concentration camps until April of 1945, when he was finally executed on Heinrich Himmler's direct orders just weeks before the war's end. But there was, of course, more to come. The Special Operations Executive in particular, a British espionage agency, had begun to see assassinations as a viable means to bring about change. British double agents like Alexander Foote and Bill Phillips also made attempts in 1939. They planned to bomb Hitler during a dinner at a Munich restaurant. However, the lack of accessible explosives caused the plot to falter before it even reached execution. Another of their operations in these early wartime years was Operation Foxley, a British plan involving an assassination attempt on Hitler during his daily walks at the Berghof, his alpine retreat. Though the plan was meticulously developed and involved sniper training and gaining insight into Hitler's schedule, it was ultimately called off with concerns about the ramifications of killing Hitler without a clear strategy for what would follow next in Germany. Even so, Operation Foxley demonstrated the lengths to which the Allied intelligence agencies were willing to go to eliminate the threat at its source. That was, of course, until it came time to act. Towards the end of 1939, however, General Kurt von Hammerstein-Equord, a former commander of the German army and an ardent critic of Hitler, also sought to act, with this attempt actually packing some willpower come time to take action. He planned to assassinate Hitler during an inspection visit at the Siegfried Line, a series of fortifications along Germany's western border. It was there that Hammerstein-Equord had hoped to ensure a fatal accident took place. However, Hitler declined the invitation to visit, supposedly due to deteriorating winter conditions, and the opportunity slipped away, leaving Hammerstein-Equord unsuccessful and yet another daring plan unfulfilled. Not all assassination attempts originated from within Germany or the Western Allies, though. From June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, a surprise invasion of Russia which dragged Stalin and the USSR into the war against Nazi Germany. The brutal and expansive invasion devastated the Soviet Union, causing millions of casualties and leaving entire cities in ruins. This added the Soviets to the now rather long list of those seeking to put an end to Hitler's life, seen unanimously as the architect of their suffering. Wasting no time, Stalin and his agents got to work targeting locations where Hitler was expected to be, but it proved almost impossible to pinpoint him through the available intelligence due to his now ridiculously hectic travel schedule, a payoff of his growing paranoia. The Soviets also devised plans to use unconventional methods of assassination, even going so far as to consider tainting Moscow's own water supply to take out Nazi leadership during occupation events. One particularly ambitious and somewhat bizarre plan was ideated that very same June of 1941, involving the use of ballerinas and musicians armed with grenades to assassinate Hitler during one of the German occupation's cultural events, attempting to gain proximity under the guise of performance. Ultimately, though, it was deemed impractical and shelved before it could move to an actionable phase. In March of 1942, Soviet bombers carried out missions aimed at striking sites Hitler was rumoured to visit in occupied territories like Minsk, Belarus, and Vilnius. Unfortunately, yet again, faulty intelligence and the unpredictable nature of Hitler's travel schedule meant that these bombing raids missed their mark and achieved nothing but fruitless collateral damage. Later that year, Polish resistance members sabotaged train lines in hopes of derailing Hitler's personal locomotive, but of course, he wasn't on board, his unpredictable movements besting the Eastern efforts for a third time. At this point, Hitler's narrow escapes and the sheer number of attempts on his life began to influence his behaviour. His paranoia grew, vindicated by having him saved not once, not twice, but 3 separate times in such close succession. He became increasingly distrustful of those around him, and this heightened wariness led him to take more drastic security measures, heavily limiting public appearances and distancing himself from all but his most trusted inner circle. This isolation, though, only bred further mistrust. Every time he survived an attempt on his life, it seemed to heighten his fear and yet also reaffirm his belief in a divine providence protecting him. But while many of these attempts failed due to bad luck, unforeseen circumstances, or the inefficiency of the conspirators, they nonetheless revealed a chink in the Nazi regime's armour, and Hitler himself knew it. A significant portion of Germany's own military and many ordinary citizens hated him enough to risk their lives trying to bring him down. The physical and psychological toll of Hitler's growing distrust was evident even in his relationship with high-ranking officers, leaving an air of suspicion that rippled through the Nazi command structure. An example of this was General Henning von Tresckow, one of the most persistent of Hitler's opponents within Germany's military. In March of 1943, he made not 1, not 2, not even 3, but 4 separate attempts on the Führer's life. This was a man on a mission, and his determination was unmatched. In his first attempt, Tresckow devised an intricate plan to blow up Hitler's plane using a bomb disguised as 2 bottles of Cointreau. With assistance from Schlabrendorf, a trusted ally, the bomb was successfully placed on the plane. As Hitler departed Smolensk to return to his headquarters, Tresckow's heart must have raced. Everything seemed to have fallen into place perfectly. But of course, yet again, luck was not on their side. The cold temperatures in the plane's luggage compartment caused the bomb's fuse to malfunction, sparing Hitler once more. General von Gersdorf, another member of Tresckow's circle, took a more direct approach later in their second attempt, volunteering to outright give his life for the cause. He carried explosives on his person, intending to detonate them during a tour of an exhibition with Hitler. Gersdorf was prepared for a suicide mission if it meant killing the Führer. However, Hitler's swift movement through the exhibit cut the tour short, leaving Gersdorf without enough time to execute the detonation. For their third effort came one of the most well-known plots to assassinate Hitler during this period. They would plant a bomb on Hitler's plane as he departed from Smolensk after a visit to the Eastern Front. Tresckow and Schlabrendorf disguised the explosive device as a gift containing, again, 2 bottles of Cointreau, which they managed to hand over to one of Hitler's aides to be loaded onto his aircraft. The bomb was set with a delayed fuse, timed to detonate mid-flight, and as Hitler took off, the conspirators waited in anxious anticipation, knowing that if the plot succeeded, it could change the course of the war. But fate once again, was on Hitler's side. Their previous failed attempts had taught them nothing. Due again to the extreme cold at high altitude, the fuse malfunctioned and the bomb never detonated. Hitler landed safely, and the conspirators were forced to retrieve the package before it was discovered, barely avoiding exposure. Despite the failure, Tresco and his associates were undeterred. Their commitment to ending Hitler's rule only grew stronger. To top off this month of back-to-back action, Gersdorff volunteered his life yet again, sour as previous failure and stubborn in his willingness to die for the cause. He would again carry explosives on his person and detonate them while in close proximity to Hitler during a tour of a captured Soviet weapons exhibition in Berlin, an apparent perfect repeat of the second attempt. This time, they would get the job done, but as you may have guessed, just as the circumstances had seemingly replicated, so would their failure come to be as well. Gersdorff, with only minutes to act, was focused, ready to seize the window of opportunity, but Hitler, paranoid as ever, rushed through the exhibition much faster than anticipated, leaving Gersdorff without the opportunity to trigger his bomb. It's almost like Hitler knew it was coming. And at this point, he most likely did. The general had to quickly defuse the device to avoid detection and, miraculously, managed to walk away undetected. By mid-1943, though, the war had reached a turning point. The tides were shifting against Germany, and the Axis powers began to face significant losses on multiple fronts. The Battle of Stalingrad had shattered Nazi morale, Northern Africa and Italy had been lost to the Allies, and that's before we mention the massive increase in Allied bombing that had devastated German infrastructure. Germany was now on the defensive, and even that was an optimistic way of describing a situation that rapidly got worse. With a grim realization that the war was at the top of a slippery slope towards Axis defeat, a renewed urgency swept over those who were still determined to end Hitler's reign. They understood that as the tide of the war shifted against Germany, the opportunity to eliminate Hitler and force a negotiated peace might be their last hope to save their country from utter destruction. They had to act now if they wanted to preserve their homeland. This urgency drove the conspirators to take increasingly desperate risks, knowing that their time was running out and that any delay could mean losing their only chance at stopping the Führer, and with it, any hope of retaining Germany's integrity. The first of these newfound desperate attempts came before the end of 1943 in November. Major Axel von den Busch, another Wehrmacht officer disillusioned with the Nazi regime, volunteered to assassinate Hitler during a planned uniform inspection. The idea was to use a concealed explosive device to kill Hitler while demonstrating new winter uniforms for the Wehrmacht. Yet another suicide mission. However, the plan was thwarted when an Allied air raid destroyed the shipment of uniforms, forcing the demonstration to be postponed indefinitely. Busch, undeterred, volunteered to be part of another assassination attempt in early 1944 when a new uniform demonstration was scheduled for February, and in his eyes, he was just finishing what he'd started. However, on January the 30th, von den Busch was severely wounded by Soviet shrapnel on the Eastern Front, resulting in an amputation of his right leg, rendering him unable to carry out the plot. Another officer, Captain Ewald von Kleist, volunteered to carry out the mission in von den Busch's place during a demonstration on February 11th, 1944. These were desperate times, and thus there were no shortage of desperate men. As always, though, fate would intervene, Hitler postponed and eventually cancelled the event. Another failure. By mid-1944, it was evident to many within the German high command that Germany was failing. All but the most delusional could see the war was lost. Within the Wehrmacht, this was abundantly clear. Their window of opportunity was closing fast, and so this was their last chance to depose the Führer and salvage whatever good they could for Germany's future. It was time for their Hail Mary, Operation Valkyrie. Operation Valkyrie was originally a contingency plan designed to maintain order in the event of internal unrest. But Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, the leader central to the plot alongside General Friedrich Ulbricht and Major General Henning von Tresco, had adapted it into a plan to straight up topple Hitler's regime. It wasn't just about killing Hitler, it was about triggering a military coup immediately after, seizing Berlin and neutralizing the SS to pave the way for peace negotiations with the Allies. This plot required nothing short of perfect timing and the level of coordination that made the endeavour almost impossibly ambitious. But, as we mentioned earlier, it was their last shot, and desperate times called for desperate measures. On June 6, 1944, the very same day of the Allied invasion of Normandy, Stauffenberg attempted to execute the plan for the first time. He carried a briefcase filled with explosives to a meeting at Hitler's headquarters. Stauffenberg hoped to assassinate Hitler along with several of his top commanders and inner circle to create a power vacuum ripe for their coup. However, the attempt was foiled as key Nazi leaders like Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring, whose deaths were critical for the operation's success, failed to attend the meeting. The absence of these figures forced Stauffenberg to abort the attempt. The plan required not just Hitler's death, but the decapitation of the entire Nazi command structure all in one fell swoop. The clock was ticking. By July, Stauffenberg, undeterred by the failure in June, planned his second attempt. On July 6, 1944, he again carried plastic explosives, this time to a meeting at Hitler's residence at the Berghof in Bavaria. He was accompanied by fellow conspirators who were standing by to launch the coup as soon as Hitler was confirmed dead. The setting of Berghof, however, was too informal for the assassination. Hitler was surrounded by friends and family members, not the military and SS personnel the conspirators needed to eliminate. Stauffenberg couldn't bring himself to detonate the bomb, knowing that killing Hitler alone would be insufficient without immediately neutralizing the Nazi apparatus that supported him. Another opportunity came less than a week later on July 11th, where once more Stauffenberg attended a high-level meeting, this time at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters, with a bomb primed and ready. Stauffenberg was prepared to strike, but yet again, key figures were absent. Stauffenberg knew the coup's chances were slim without their elimination, and despite their desperation, was forced to withdraw the plan once more. The sheer frustration among the conspirators grew, but a seemingly golden opportunity came on July 15th, 1944, during yet another meeting at the Wolf's Lair. Everyone was there this time, and the bomb was ready. All he had to do was set the fuse, and success would be theirs. But just before he could get into position, right before he could act, fate swooped in for the Fuhrer once more. The meeting was cut short, and Hitler left abruptly before Stauffenberg could arm the explosive device. He couldn't believe it. He had no choice but to abort yet again. The conspiracy was unraveling, and the risk of exposure was simply too high. One more failed attempt would be their undoing. The pressure was now insurmountable. For the Valkyrie conspirators, it was now do or die. And so on July 20th, 1944, came their last-ditch effort, the most famous and closest attempt on Hitler's life, the culmination of all previous work and sacrifice. Stauffenberg arrived at the Wolf's Lair with his briefcase packed with plastic explosives, a timer set, and a determination born of necessity. This time, there would be no do-overs. This time, Hitler, along with several high-ranking officers, gathered in a wooden conference hut, a perfect setting for the bomb. The guards should have searched Stauffenberg's briefcase before allowing him entry, but his status as a decorated war hero who had sacrificed his own hand and an eye on the mantle of fascism made it impossible for them to inconvenience him on his way to the Fuhrer. Perhaps, he thought, our luck is beginning to change. Stauffenberg placed the briefcase under the table, mere feet from where Hitler stood. He then promptly excused himself, leaving the room just before detonation. And at 12:42 p.m, the bomb exploded with a deafening roar, sending shockwaves through the compound. Windows shattered, smoke filled the air, and debris scattered across the room. 4 people died, and several others were injured. For a brief moment, Stauffenberg thought they'd done the impossible, and that the mission had been a success. However, of all things, an unassuming oak table leg had saved Hitler's life. The table had absorbed much of the bomb's blast, deflecting the shockwave away from Hitler. With little more than seared trousers, perforated eardrums, and an aggravated right eye, The Führer had survived. Some sources say he even found his cartoonishly shredded trousers amusing and danced around laughing at the whole affair. But jokes aside, Hitler's survival could spell doom for many of the conspirators who had placed their hope in Operation Valkyrie. Stauffenberg, believing the Führer dead, returned to Berlin to initiate the coup. For a few tense hours, it seemed as though Operation Valkyrie might succeed, as orders were issued to secure key government buildings and arrest Nazi officials. The reality of Hitler's survival, however, quickly spread, and the coup faltered. The SS and Gestapo moved swiftly, regaining control of the situation, and Hitler himself, bruised but very much still alive, soon appeared on radio broadcast declaring the assassination attempt had failed and vowing retribution. Within hours, he had the Gestapo identify and arrest many of the conspirators, including Stauffenberg, and that same night, Stauffenberg, along with other key plotters, was executed by firing squad at the Blenderblock, the headquarters of the German Army Reserve in Berlin. His final words were, "Long live our sacred Germany." They would not be the only ones to die that day, however. Rommel, Germany's most glamorous general, had been named as a potential leader for a post-Hitler Germany. Rommel himself didn't know anything about this, but when it became clear during the interrogation, Hitler assumed he was in on the plot and ordered that he end his life himself or have his entire family die along with him. Rommel agreed. He gave his wife a kiss and said, "You'll receive a phone call later today. It won't be good news." After saying his goodbyes, he was driven into the woods, where he was given a pistol by his escorts and left alone for a moment, where he unceremoniously shot himself dead, just as ordered. But just like that, Hitler had lost his best general, and arguably his only hope of holding back the Western Front. Any chances for Germany's future was now more or less squashed out for good. The failure of Operation Valkyrie brought with it a purge that reached all levels of military and civilian life, extinguishing what remained of organised resistance within Germany. The reprisals were swift and brutal. Hundreds of conspirators, sympathisers, and even those only tangentially connected to the plot were arrested, tortured, and executed. The immense majority of the resistance died that day, with only a handful of survivors living to see the end of the war. Among them was one of the men who had already been ready to trade his life for Hitler, Major Axel von den Busch, who, thanks to his hospitalisation after the injuries which had prevented him from that very task, avoided involvement in the final phases. That, along with the loyalty of his brethren who refused to give up his name, allowed him to live on. He would live until 1993, able to see Germany recover and begin to resemble what they had once hoped they could help it become. Operation Valkyrie did succeed in one key way, though. It had essentially ended all effective control of the military with a now gargantuan wedge of suspicion driven between the officer class of the armed forces and the Führer. Anything less than a yes man was now outright discarded, and with no one left to trust, Hitler himself assumed direct command of all military affairs, which went about as well as you'd expect. He may have been a corporal in the First World War, but he was no general. Germany's demise was just around the corner. The Allies, too, were well aware of the pitiful state of things and basically gave up on their plans to assassinate Hitler, opting instead to prosecute the war to its final victory. The simple fact was, by this stage, the war was going better for the Allies with Hitler in it, and now that he had taken personal command of his army, he was just making a wonderful mess of things. If Hitler was successfully killed, he might be replaced by a more competent military mind. Better to let him live a few more months so he can carry on sabotaging the German army with his delusional strategies. Despite the lack of official operations, though, scattered attempts still persisted. There were still those willing to take the risk, driven by the reality that every day that passed, tens of thousands died unthinkably gruesome deaths, and taking Hitler's life, however unlikely success may seem, was still worth a try if it could mean ending the war and saving countless innocents from further suffering. And to be fair, the efforts on the Allies' end had never truly stopped, but rather been briefly overshadowed by the German resistance. Two in particular happened briefly before the July 20th plot, both carried out by British intelligence, First was Operation Foxley, a previously abandoned plot from earlier in the war, revisited as one of the last viable options. The plan, as you'll recall, was to assassinate Hitler during his morning walks at the Berghof, his Alpine retreat. Every morning, Hitler would take a solitary stroll at a predictable time, providing a seemingly perfect opportunity to strike. It never came to fruition, though, because the British didn't really get how much the German ranks disliked Hitler, and they were worried that if they killed him, it wouldn't end the war, but it would rather make Hitler a martyr and inspire more violence and a better leader to take the reins. You know, as the old saying goes, better the devil you know than the devil you don't, and such was their conclusion. So yet another opportunity came and went, with the Führer's heart still beating away. Thankfully, though, not everyone in the SOE agreed with this sentiment, leading them to another method of assassination later that year, an attempt to poison Hitler's train, the Führersonderzug. The idea was to lace the water supply on the train with a fast-acting toxin, targeting Hitler during one of his travels across occupied Europe. However, the difficulty in accessing the train's water supply and logistical complications surrounding the deployment led to the plan being abandoned. As the war approached its final phase, there was one last batch of attempts laying in wait for Hitler, emerging from his own inner circle, the remains of the resistance. Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect and Minister of Armaments, allegedly devised multiple assassination plots in the chaotic final months of the Third Reich. Speer, who had grown increasingly disgusted with Hitler and the Nazi leadership as the war unravelled, planned to gas the Führer and other top Nazis in the bunker using the ventilation system. This, however, proved impossible with Hitler's now outlandish security protocols, and after a disheartened attempt, he was forced back to the drawing board. Next, Speer tried to organise a shootout to kill Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann, men he believed would continue the senseless fight even as Germany crumbled around them. But by 1945, the collapse of the Reich made any cohesive assassination effort nearly impossible. The infrastructure and organisation required for such a plot disintegrated as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, and the remaining Nazis entrenched themselves, surrounded by devoted loyalists and soldiers. There would simply be no opportunity to take them out in one fell sweep. In his exasperation, Speer even considered using gas shells to poison the Nazi leadership in their underground bunkers. He planned to use artillery shells filled with lethal chemicals and fire them directly into the underground complex. However, the technical challenges were once again obscene, coupled with the impossibility of organising a successful attack amid the chaos of the collapsing German front. All of this rendered the plan futile. Despite his intentions, Speer ultimately found himself unable to act effectively against Hitler and his high-ranking officials, each attempt being shut down arguably before it even started. In April 1945, as the Red Army closed in on Berlin, Speer made one final attempt to assassinate Hitler. He allegedly planned to ambush him and the remaining Nazi leaders within the Führer bunker. However, by this point, the war was in its death throes and Hitler had become essentially inaccessible, surrounded by devoted SS guards willing to die for him if need be. He aborted the mission and made his way to safety. It's really important to note that some historians have since questioned the sincerity of Speer's efforts, as corroborating his claims is all but impossible. Whether they were genuine acts of resistance or post-war attempts to distance himself from the regime's crimes remains debated to this day, with most leaning towards the latter. Either way though, no practical difference was made. The collapse of the German war machine had left anyone, Speer or otherwise, powerless to execute a plan of any kind against the Führer, who now lay in hiding, waiting for the inevitable, only to watch as his regime came to its inevitable, catastrophic and long-awaited end. It was on this day that, in an ironic technicality, an attempt on the Führer's life would finally hit its mark. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life in the Führer bunker. With a cyanide capsule and a gunshot, he ended the chapter on Nazi Germany and his brutal dictatorship, instead choosing to die on his own terms rather than face capture by the Soviet forces bearing down on Berlin. His final order would be to request that 200 litres of gasoline are delivered to the bunker so that he could burn his body before the enemy gets a hold of it. It's a ridiculously selfish request when street fighting was raging quite literally above his bunker. Men were shot dead attempting to siphon gasoline off half-destroyed cars in the street, picked off by the Soviets mere yards away. The Third Reich, once stretching from Africa to the outskirts of Moscow, having ruled over some 100 million people, the great empire that fought 3 global superpowers at once, was now reduced to a handful of battered men sucking gas out of abandoned cars. And, despite being under direct orders from the Führer himself, the best the Third Reich could muster was a measly 50 litres of fuel. They delivered this gasoline to the Führer, and then, his pistol in one hand and pill in the other, he did what countless before him had failed to, and pulled the trigger. The death that so many had strived to achieve through bombs, bullets, poison, and countless other methods born out of immeasurable desperation is ultimately carried out by Hitler himself, a final act of defiance that robbed the countless would-be assassins of their intended justice.